distance.
So I wanted, on behalf of the site and the Friends of the Longfellow House, Washington Headquarters National Historic Site, to give you a very warm welcome. This, especially in light of recent concerns. So it's nice to see you tonight. You need hand sanitizer, it's in the back. Help yourself. We still have a supply of it. Tonight we celebrate Evacuation Day, which is when Bostonians asserted their authority and General George Washington compelled the British troops to leave the city. The event occurred on March 17, 1776, and is still a local holiday 244 years later, which is a fact that baffled me as a Californian when I first moved here. It is a charming but very unique holiday, I think. To talk to you about the significance of the 9 months that Washington spent here, known as the Siege of Boston, we welcome back author and historian John Bell, who I think you might know. He is an individual steeped in revolutionary knowledge about Boston. He's the author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannons Ignited the Revolutionary War, and maintains the excellent blog, which you can go to here, which boasts the tagline, History, Analysis, and Unabashed Gossip about the Start of the American Revolution in Massachusetts. One of my favorite lines. Tonight he will discuss the important contributions that Indigenous Americans made during the first months of the American Revolution. So welcome, join me in welcoming John to the site.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for everyone. Thank you to the Friends of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, for sponsoring this event, and to the National Park Service for sponsoring the original research that went into this event. Because several years ago, I wrote a study for the National Park Service on General George Washington's months here in Cambridge, and one small aspect of that study was his relations with Native Americans. But his experiences with them is just one part of the story, because there were Native Americans fighting in the Siege of Boston before he arrived. And they came from different communities and backgrounds, they had all sorts of different experiences. And so tonight I want to look at the beginning of the Revolutionary War through Native eyes and see how that is a different perspective on the politics and the war itself. We are on land that in 1600 was occupied by the Massachusetts people who spoke an Algonquian language. They described themselves as the people of the Great Hill, meaning the Blue Hills. And as a coastal people, the Massachusetts made early contact with mariners from England and with diseases from Eurasia. As we know, the epidemics can be very scary. The death toll from those epidemics, combined with pressures from the Pequot people who lived to the south of Massachusetts, made the Massachusetts leadership at first welcome English settlers as possible allies. But then the influx of Englishmen that started in 1620 accelerated with the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony 10 years later. The first English families to settle in Cambridge arrived in 1630, and within a decade it was large enough to be incorporated as a town. Later in the 1630s, the English went to war with the Pequots, and the Massachusetts people, who were already diminished, were caught in the middle. By the 1640s, 20,000 British settlers had moved to New England, and people of English ancestry outnumbered the population of natives. I'm going to move ahead by over a century. Here's a snapshot of the Massachusetts census of 1765. And in each town, as you see, the province wanted to count the number of houses, families, people in different categories. In Boston, for instance, in the third and fourth column here, we can see that there were 21 males counted as Indians and 16 females. Here in Cambridge, however, when we look at those rows, they had no Indians at all. There were also supposed to be no Indians in Charlestown, Watertown, or Woburn. And as we'll see, there's reason to doubt those figures. That it's not just this clear cut. But this was obviously a great change from 100 years earlier. Where had the natives of Massachusetts gone? Many had died in the epidemics and wars. Some had been enslaved and shipped away. Most survivors had been driven into what the Puritans called praying towns, set aside for Indians who had converted to Christianity and to the European way of farming. And those communities allowed natives to maintain some of their culture and communities and families while adapting to the dominant British society. By 1765, Massachusetts had created 14 praying towns, After King Philip's War in 1677, the colony disbanded 10 of those communities. And those that survived in legal form included Gage Head on Martha's Vineyard, which is now known once again by the Wampanoag name of Aquina, and the mainland towns of Natick and Mashpee, Natick here, Mashpee down here, and such informal communities as Pugapog, which is now mainly within Canton, and where the Massachusetts still live. In 1737, the Massachusetts province chartered a new praying town in the western end of its territory, which became known as Stockbridge. And I'll get back to that later. All those communities remained under pressure from the hunger of white farmers for more land, and gradually natives in those towns lost control of the town offices and of much of the land assigned to them. Another development in those decades was a lot of intermarriage between natives and people of African ancestry who had been brought to New England as slaves. And as a result, the non-white racial categories of Indian, Negro, and Mulatto, which they used a lot, they don't have clear boundaries in this period. I've heard a historian talk about how a government file on the same person can identify her as Indian on the outside and then Negro on the documents inside, depending on the incentives of that person or of the bureaucrat keeping those papers. We'll see some of those shifting categories later. In all, at the start of 1775, about 1,700 people were classified as Indian and living in Massachusetts, most in the southeastern quadrant, including Cape Cod and the islands. But native men came to the siege of Boston from many parts of Massachusetts and from other parts of North America. We can divide the Native Americans at the siege of Boston into 3 groups. First, those who lived within white communities and served in their towns predominantly white military companies. Second, there was a group of Indians, a whole company from Stockbridge, who came to the siege lines as a separate, easily identifiable group dressed and fighting in Indian style. And third, there were emissaries from native communities outside of New England gathering information to help their people decide whether to remain neutral or to ally with one batch of quarrelsome British or the other. The first set of Native American soldiers consisted of those men living in English-dominated colonial towns. They mustered and enlisted alongside their neighbors. For poor men, and especially for poor young men, army service was a way to earn some income, and it could also be exciting and a chance to prove themselves. And here are some stories of those men as we can glimpse them from the records. David Langston was living in West Cambridge in 1775 in the village then called Monotony. That's one of the different spellings. Langston was among the men from Cambridge who had served in the French and Indian War. He was labeled as a young man in 1769, so he'd probably been only in his teens when he enlisted for military service. Later sources look back and describe Langston as both mulatto and half Indian. As a man of color, he was exempt from militia training under Massachusetts law. However, he was on the area's alarm list, along with older men and others who didn't have to train but were still expected to turn out with their guns in an emergency. And on April 19, 1775, Monotony faced an emergency. Hours before dark, a column of British soldiers marched through the village on its way to Concord. Around noon, another column followed, the reinforcements. And in between those two sets of redcoats, the local militia companies mustered and headed west to confront the King's troops from a strategic distance. That left the alarm list, or the exempts, in the town. And sometime that afternoon, word came that of a couple of British Army supply wagons rolling west under the protection of several redcoats. According to local chronicler Samuel Abbott Smith, the Monotony exempts met at once at Benjamin Cooper's tavern to form some plan of capturing the wagons. They chose for their leader David Langston. Now, putting a man of color in a leadership role was very unusual for colonial American society. But Langston had gained a reputation as a man of undoubted bravery and determination, probably respect gained from his military service. Langston's group ambushed one British wagon near what would become the corner of Massachusetts Avenue and Medford Street. A company from Chelsea attacked the other wagon, 2 redcoats were killed, the others fled and then surrendered. Monotony later became the town of Arlington, and it memorialized this skirmish with a monument crediting the old men of monogamy. But their leader was a middle-aged man. He was exempt from militia training not because of his age, but because of his skin. David Langston also served in a militia company called up to support the Continental Army's push on to Dorchester Heights in March 1776, the move that brought the siege of Boston to a successful close. Another Native American in the New England Army was Jonas Obsco, born in Natick in June 1739. 10 years later, his name appeared on a list of all the Indians in Natick, separate from all other family groups, so he was apparently an orphan. In 1764, Jonas Obsco married Mary Speen, also mentioned on that list of Indians, and they started to raise a family. Both Jonas and Mary owned land as members of the Natick tribe, but otherwise they were poor. Neither of them could write. By 1772, they were in debt to their doctors, and they asked the Massachusetts legislature to approve the sale of some of their land. That was how many native citizens of the praying towns ended up losing their inheritance of land. Without other resources, without other forms of property, they fell into debt and had to sell off their real estate. Poverty was probably also why Jonas Obsco signed up to serve in the Massachusetts Army in May 1775. Being in the Army meant leaving Mary and their children at home, but it was a way for steady income. Obsco served at least through November when he received a bounty coat. He later enlisted for a 1777 campaign against the British in Rhode Island. Around that time, the Obsco's marriage broke up. In the 1780s, both Jonas and Mary sold off more of their land. Mary died by 1788, leaving one child. By 1796, the Natick selectmen described Jonas Obsco as an Indian man who is blind and is also wholly unable to go by reason of the rheumatism, and has not a state to support him. He died still in Natick in 1805. Dedham was a large English town so near Natick that it also had a sizable native minority. Sarah David was an Indian woman of Dedham in 1767 when she married Alexander Quapish, described as an Indian man of Yarmouth out on Cape Cod. Sarah died 7 years later in 1774, making Alexander a widower. The following May, Alexander Quapish enlisted in the Massachusetts Army from Dedham, and on July 3rd, 1775, he happened to be one of the soldiers assigned to the main guard. That was also General George Washington's first full day in Cambridge when he was sizing up the troops. So Private Quapish might have been one of the first soldiers of color that Virginia planters saw bearing arms. In the fall of 1775, Quapish was taken sick in the army near Cambridge and was dismissed. He reached the home of Michael Bacon in Needham in November and died there the following March. Jacob Paganet was another native man born in Natick, baptized in November 1754. His father was a veteran of the French and Indian War who had suffered severe wounds and received assistance from the province. Nonetheless, Paganet enlisted in the Massachusetts Army from nearby Framingham when he was 20 years old. He enlisted in Captain Thomas Drury's company within Colonel John Nixon's regiment. But within a couple of months, Drury evidently tried to move his company under the command of another colonel. Private Paganet and 28 fellow soldiers didn't like that, so they signed this petition complaining to General Artemus Ward about how their captain was acting under a malevolent disposition. And in addition to Paganet's signature, we can identify two of the other soldiers on this document as black. They were all part of the same company. There was no indication of unequal status among these privates. And obviously they were all willing to stand up for what they thought was their right to serve under the colonel that they had originally signed up to serve under. And it worked. Jacob Paganet married Colonel Nixon, remained in Colonel Nixon's regiment in 1775, and then re-enlisted in 1776 under that officer's brother, Colonel Thomas Nixon. Paganet fought in the New York campaign and re-enlisted again in early 1777. Nixon's regiment fought at Saratoga, And at some point, before or after that battle, Private Paganet became ill. He died in November 1777, probably near Albany, New York, around his 23rd birthday. And here's one last glimpse of a soldier who identified as native while serving in a predominantly white company. John Challen, or Chewin, marched on April 19th with the Minutemen of Lancaster, Massachusetts. Then he signed up for 8 months in the Army. Towards the end of 1775, Chewin was put on the rolls of a new company in the reorganized Continental Army, but then he deserted. We don't know when Chewin left or why. Was he unhappy with his new officers? Did he just want to spend some time home with his wife before coming back? All we know is that Captain Jeremiah Hill advertised a $1 reward for him. It's almost a negligible sum. I wonder if this is just going through the motions to put out the reward and possibly even insulting him. Maybe to attempt to shame him into coming back. In that ad, Captain Hill described Chewin as a mulatto, but calls himself Indian. It said that he has a wife in Holden, a proper Indian squaw. He loves a good deal of rum. That ad, again, shows us this fuzzy boundary between racial categories. Here's a man living with an Indian woman, but, according to his captain, not really an Indian. What did those labels mean for Chewin's legal status in the Army? A few years back, I spoke in this room about how in October 1775, General Washington advised the Continental Congress to expel all Negro soldiers from the Continental Army at the end of the year. Did that same policy cover the mulatto soldiers? The language of the regulation doesn't use that word, but I suspect at least some Continental Army officers considered that anyone who seemed to have visible African ancestry, anybody who looked black, was excluded under the new regulations. And that rule would have affected a lot of the native soldiers from Massachusetts because of this overlap between the native and African populations. Just before this policy went into effect, General Washington changed his mind. He let Negro soldiers re-enlist. But when John Chewin left the Army in late 1775, he probably felt that the Continental Army didn't want him anymore. Instead, Chewin served in the Massachusetts Militia in a couple of stretches over the next several months, and then he transferred back into the Continental Army for 3 years in 1777. So those are the variety of different situations that brought men of native ancestry into the Continental Army, and the variety of ways that they ended up in their service, unfortunately a lot of them dying young. Now I'll discuss a group of native soldiers who stood out from the typical New England men because they maintained more of their traditional indigenous culture. This group came from Stockbridge at the far western end of Massachusetts. This was the province's newest praying town, originally set up for natives who had converted to Congregationalist Christianity and European-style agriculture. There were about 200 or 300 people of native descent living in and around Stockbridge. Following the lead of the scholar Colin Calloway, I'm going to discuss Stockbridge as a community rather than a tribe or a nation. The town was the central fireplace of the Mohican nation, but it wasn't just Mohican people who were living there. There were also people from the Housatonic and Wappinger peoples and elsewhere. What brought them together was this shared commitment to Christianity and to living in a hybrid of traditional native and European style. At this time, there was a larger group of natives, mostly Wampanoag, in around Mashpee, the old praying town in southeastern Massachusetts. The Mashpee had recently gone through a lot of conflicts with their neighbors and with the provincial government, so they even applied for relief from London. So they weren't eager to fight for the white men of Massachusetts. Not until later in the war do we see a large number of men from the Mashpee community joining the Continental Army. The Stockbridge natives were also under pressure from nearby whites. Over the preceding decades, several families had sold most of their land to pay off debts. The population of whites in the area had now greatly outnumbered the 200 to 300 natives, and the western part of Stockbridge, which was settled mostly by English families, was splitting off to become a separate town. But the Stockbridge community saw more potential working with the Massachusetts rebels. Some of the families had just come through a land dispute with New Yorkers because they saw part of their territory as spilling over this arbitrary border of, that the British set up. In 1774, one of the Stockbridge Community's missionary founders and protectors had died, so they were looking for a new protective alliance. In the fall of 1774, the country towns of Massachusetts began to strengthen their militia forces. Stockbridge was part of this movement, organizing a Minuteman company. Several native men joined, and in fact became lieutenants and sergeants. But the captain, the man in charge, was a white man, William Goodrich. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the rebel government, responded by allocating 23 pounds to buy blankets and ribbons for the three dozen Stockbridge natives who had signed up for the militia. The Congress didn't do that for the other companies. It also sent a special message on April 1st, 1775, saying, "It affords us great pleasure and satisfaction to hear that our brothers, the natives of Stockbridge, are ready and willing to take up the hatchet in the cause of liberty." So they were, really the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was laying it on thick because they saw these men as valuable soldiers. After a 2-day conference about this, the Stockbridge's leader at the time responded with a statement that he hoped that the quarrel between you and Old England could be mended. He proposed that he would visit the Iroquois to feel out their loyalties. But on April 21st, news of the fighting at Lexington and Concord arrived, and the Stockbridge Company marched east. By the end of the month, the British Commander-in-Chief, General Thomas Gage, reported, "A company of Indians are come down from Stockbridge, and more are to be provided if they are wanted." Ultimately, 17 men from the Stockbridge community decided to enlist for the year. Among the other Stockbridge natives who had visited the Boston siege lines around the time was the chief, Daniel Nimmenham, and 10 years before he had gone to London on a lobbying mission and had even met King George. So he actually had more connections than anybody else at the siege, practically. These warriors stood out in the New England Army because they lived separately with their families and they wore war paint. The Reverend William Emerson of Concord described the Stockbridge soldiers in early July. "Last Saturday visited the camp, or rather wigwams, of the Indians. They are permitted to live by themselves in a very thick wood that belongs to Inman Farm." And here we see on a map, this is the location of Inman Farm, so the woods are somewhere around there. That is, of course, the area that we now call Inman Square. They have got, some of them, got their squaws and papooses with them. I had the pleasure of sitting down with them at a fine mess of clams, cooked and eat in the real Indian taste. I wish you had been there to see how generously they put their fingers into the dish, and picked out some of the largest clams to give me, and with what a gust I eat them. When Lieutenant Paul Lunt described the raising of a new flag on Prospect Hill on July 18th, he said the ceremony ended with a war whoop by the Indians. Here is a picture of the Stockbridge Soldier, drawn in 1778 by a Hessian captain named Johann von Ewald, and he just recorded the man's clothing this way. Their costume was a shirt of coarse linen down to the knees, long trousers also of linen down to the feet, on which they wore shoes of deerskin, and the head was covered with a hat made of baste. Their weapons were a rifle or a musket, a quiver with some 20 arrows, and a short battle axe, which they know how to throw very skillfully. Through the nose and in the ears they wore rings, and on their heads only the hair of the crown remained standing in a circle the size of a dollar piece, the remainder being shaved off bare. They pull out with pincers all the hairs of the head, as well as those on all the other parts of the body. It's not certain that this is how the Stockbridge soldiers were dressing back in 1775, but they definitely stood out from the rest of the New England Army. The Stockbridge Company went into action on a month after the arrival, as we see in the diary of the chaplain of the regiment they were assigned to, the Reverend David Avery. On May 28th, there was several hours of fighting over livestock and hay on Hogg's Island and Noddle's Island. These are no longer islands. So much landfill has been done that this is now basically Logan Airport. But at this time, these are islands, and this is what was sometimes called Chelsea Creek. The idea behind this fighting was to get the livestock off the islands so that the British down here in Boston could not use it for food. during the fighting, which was really the second battle of the war after Lexington and Concord, a Royal Navy schooner called the Diana grounded here in the Chelsea Creek area. And the next day, the Reverend Mr. Avery wrote, "About noon, Captain Yoking, a Stockbridge Indian, and I reconnoitered the ground east of the schooner and judged that the taking off the cattle was practicable." This reference to Captain Yoking, a Stockbridge Indian, was very interesting. Most sources about the Stockbridge Company still list William Goodrich as the captain. But there is another document in Massachusetts archives that refers to a captain named Jehoiakim Yokin. And we have other sources that say that Jehoiakim Yokin was a major landowner in western Massachusetts in the previous couple of decades, and a veteran of the war against the French. So I think that shows that Jehoiakim Yokin was in command, shared command of the Stockbridge Company alongside Goodrich, particularly in combat, and that he was granted, if only as an honorific, the rank of captain. Avery's diary continues, "The captain, with 3 men, took a canoe and went about 1.25 miles upon the north side of the river from the ferry, and went across to Noddle's Island, and reconnoitered, and scouted around about 1/4 hour. And when he fixed his sentries, and another's canoe went over to his assistance, and soon took 2 horses, and mired a third, when a cannonball fell pretty near them, and 4 barges landed from the British, upon which all the scouts retreated to the main shore and came over. Upon that, I advised that they should go back and get the stock. Accordingly, they got off the stock about sunset." Another source tells us the name of one of those Stockbridge men who went out onto Noddle's Island and brought back the 2 horses. He was Henry von Hobby. On July 3rd, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety considered a special request. "Henry von Hobby, an Indian, having represented to this committee that he has taken 2 horses at Noddle's Island, one a little horse, which he is desirous of retaining as some recompense for his fatigue and risk in that action, in which, it is said, he behaved with great bravery. It is the opinion of this committee that the said Indian should be gratified in his request, which will be an encouragement to others in the service." So he wanted a prize for his feat, which is more of a native way of warfare. The next day, the Provincial Congress granted Henry von Hobby's the smaller of those 2 horses for his own use to encourage his further brave conduct and good behavior in camp. I found one more glimpse of Captain Yokin in a very unusual place, here at General Washington's headquarters. This is how it looked back in 1775 with gray paint and no porches on the side instead of yellow. Here at General Washington's headquarters, the staff made a payment on August 29th of £1 and 10 shillings to Jehoiakim Yokin, apparently for necessaries for the house. The man signed a receipt for 30 shillings, a document now in Washington's military papers. Necessary was an 18th century euphemism for an outhouse. I suspect that some of the Stockbridge men agreed to dig the general's outhouse in exchange for a little hard cash delivered to their leader. Earlier in the summer, the Stockbridge men had asked for their pay to be given to the town's delegates to the Provincial Congress, for those men to hold. The young soldiers, they said, they were feeling the temptation of spirituous liquor, and they wanted their money sent home to their families. They were also, at this point, feeling bored. The siege had turned into a stalemate. The Stockbridge men made these bold little forays close to the British lines. They killed 4 regulars on June 21st. They drove off a British scouting party on July 8th. But they really couldn't make a big difference to get over the water into Boston. They also tried to intimidate the Redcoats with their looks, because they look so different from an ordinary Massachusetts farmer. And they augmented that effect by yelling insults, brandishing knives, and occasionally mooning the enemy. On August 1st, the 2 Stockbridge men were returning from one of these sorties, and they startled the Continental sentries. Those white soldiers shot at the 2 Indians, Abraham Nonaftok and William Notoskian, and those men eventually died of their wounds. These were the first Native American casualties of the Revolutionary War. victims of what we would call friendly fire. Soon the young warriors from Stockbridge had enough of the siege. By the end of the summer, many of those soldiers went west and north to fight on other fronts or to try to win over other Indian nations. Still, the British commanders inside Boston noted that the Provincials had opened the door to the native style of warfare. General Gage wrote in September, "They have brought down all the savages they could against us here, continually firing on our advanced sentries." And eventually the British found their own allies to fight in that style. And by July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress would complain about the, quote, "merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." But we must remember that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had reached out for native support first, and they had done so even before the war began. The third step of natives present at the Siege of Boston didn't come there to fight in the war, they came to observe it. They wanted to figure out why the Bostonians, as they called the Patriots, were fighting with the rest of the British. Whose side was winning? Did it make sense to ally with either force? Some of those emissaries offered assistance to General Washington, but really most were just feeling him out, trying to gauge what he would offer. On his side, Washington tried to stick to the Continental Congress's official line, which was neutrality, encouraging the Indians to stay out of the war and not offer any help to the British, but also not offer help to the American side. So when certain of the natives did offer him help, he wasn't quite sure how to deal with it. He also really did want the help once he started to plan an invasion of Canada. So he was trying to play this balancing act. The first of those native visitors appeared on August 1st. As a New Hampshire colonel arrived in Cambridge with an Indian by the name of Lewis of the Cognawaga tribe. Lewis was also known as Colonel Lewis, and by this long name, which means cut down from a hanging. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it because I've tried badly. He had been born Lewis Cook at Saratoga around 1740. His mother was an Abenaki, and his father was of African descent, probably a British officer's servant, possibly enslaved. So from the start, Lewis was straddling traditional lines of race and nation. During King George's War, a French and Indian raiding party captured the family, and seeing the boy's African features, a French officer wanted to sell him. But his mother asked the Mohawk chiefs who were in the raiding party for it to intervene. So the Mohawks from Cognawaga adopted the mother and child, so this Abenaki child with African heritage became Mohawk. Lewis was then raised as a Catholic in the Mohawk region near Montreal. He learned to speak French. He started spelling his name in the French style. As a young man, he fought for the French Empire. So he was like General Washington, like General Gage, like other officers here at the Siege of Boston. He had been at Braddock's Retreat in 1756, but he had been on the French side. Sometime during that war, he apparently took the title of colonel for himself, but he wanted to be commissioned a colonel. After the conquest of Canada, the colony's new governors promised to respect the rights of the French-speaking Catholic Indians, also known as the Seven Nations. Still, the Cognawaga community outside Montreal, outside Montreal, developed little loyalty to the British. The May 1775 attack on Fort Ticonderoga told him that war had broken out within the British Empire. According to Lewis's own account, in the spring of 1775, he is hunting near Lake St. Francis when two Americans came to me and brought me a letter to carry to Cognawaga in Montreal. This letter said, "My brothers, don't take up any arms against the Americans because I want to fight against the British." And I left all my hunt in the woods and carried this letter to Cognawaga and delivered it to a chief. He opened the letter and was likely to be hung for it. And I returned to Lake St. Francis to get my furs and skins. New Englanders thought Lewis would be a good ally. In July, John Hurd of Haverhill, New Hampshire, told that colony's Committee of Safety, He has all along appeared friendly to the New England people, is very intelligent, and has the character among the Indian traders of an honest fellow. We have persuaded Lewis, having given a few small presents and engaging some pay for his time, to make a journey down country, paying a visit first to you and your committee at Exeter, and thence to the army at Cambridge. His time is short, he says, and he could not leave Montreal without a pass from the governor and promised to return in about 20 days, as if going out upon a hunt. He speaks very good French and English tolerably well, so as to be easily understood. Colonel Lewis arrived in Cambridge on this secret mission on August 1st. He probably hoped to learn about what the Bostonians might offer to Caughnawaga. It's not really clear whether he was a diplomat from that community's chiefs or was acting on his own. Washington and other Americans took Lewis to be an important chief. And so on August 4th, the general wrote to the Congress about their conversation. His accounts of the temper and disposition of the Indians are very favorable. He says they have been strongly solicited by Governor Carleton to engage against us, but his nation is totally averse. That threats as well as entreaties have been used without effect, that the Canadians are well disposed to the English colonies, and if any expedition is meditated against Canada, the Indians in that quarter will give all their assistance. I have endeavored to cherish those favorable dispositions and recommended him to cultivate them on his return. What I have said I enforced with a present, which I understood would be agreeable, and as he is represented to be a man of weight and consequence in his own tribe, I flatter myself his visit will have a good effect. Lewis also met with a joint committee of the Massachusetts Assembly and the Council at the Edward Fowle House in Watertown, and among their exchanges they asked him, has the governor of Canada prevailed upon the St. Francis Indians to take up arms against the colonies? And Colonel Lewis responded, the governor sent out Monsieur Saint-Loup et Beaupassion to invite several tribes of Indians to take up arms against you. At his desire, they held a great council, and the French officers gave each man half a pound of powder and a drink of brandy and an ox among them for a feast. They answered, nobody has taken up arms against them, and they would not take up arms against anybody to trouble them, and they chose to rest in peace. Upon this answer, the officers told them, if you do not take up arms, the Yankees will come and destroy you all. The Indians answered again, when those men come here to destroy us, then we will take up arms and defend ourselves, but we will not go to seek people to quarrel with them. Colonel Lewis returned to Caughnawaga. There, he said, Britain's top liaisons once again asked him to take up the tomahawk in the Grand Council against the Americans. And Lewis responded, I told them that I was for the Americans. The Seven Nations had a council of war, and Lewis argued that we must be with the Americans and join them only. He decided to help in the American attack on Quebec. Colonel Lewis was the first of many envoys and observers from the north coming here to Cambridge. On August 14th, General Washington wrote several Indians of the tribe of St. Francis, that same tribe that Massachusetts legislature was asking about, came in. The tribe of St. Francis refers to a community of Saint-François-du-Lac, also now known as Odanak, at the conjunction of the St. Francois and St. Lawrence rivers between Montreal and Quebec. Most of the St. Francis inhabitants were Abenakis. A letter published in the Pennsylvania Gazette, most likely from one of the Philadelphians on Washington's staff, added more detail about these arrivals. Yesterday, 7 Knight arrived at this camp in Cambridge, Swashen, the chief, with 4 other Indians of the St. Francois tribe. The above Indians came hither to offer their services in the cause of American liberty, have been kindly received, and are now entered the service. Swashen says he will bring 1/2 of his tribe, and engage 4 or 5 other tribes if they should be wanted. He says the Indians of Canada in general, and also the French, are greatly in our favor, and determined not to act against us. Swashen and his 4 colleagues had traveled to the Quebec province through the forests of Maine. Along the way, they had picked up 20 or 30 Norridgewocks or Pequawkets from their community on the Kennebec River, led by a man named Paul Higgins. Higgins had actually been captured in his youth during a raid on Berwick, and grew up in the Norridgewock community, and he had become their translator with the British colonists since he still remembered English. General Washington put all those natives and their translators in touch with a Connecticut colonel named Benedict Arnold. who had proposed attacking Quebec City by traveling north on approximately the same route that Challen had used to come south. At the same time, Washington knew that the Continental Congress's policy was only to seek a neutrality of the Indian nations, not to make them military allies. He told General Philip Schuyler, his colleague out of New York, "I have therefore been embarrassed in giving them an answer when they have tendered their services and assistance." When the men from St. Francis finally decided to go home, Washington urged them to visit the American troops in Ticonderoga. He probably hoped that they would choose on their own to go and support the invasion of Canada and not have to be paid into the service. Paul Higgins apparently promised Washington that the Norridgewocks and the Pegwalkets would guide Arnold through the wilderness in Maine, and he and his colleagues set out for Maine on foot. After Colonel Arnold, he was recruiting men for his expedition. One of the captains who volunteered to go was William Goodrich of Stockbridge, who I think half of his men had left. He no longer had his company to command, so he might as well go and volunteer for this other mission and recruit more men. After Colonel Arnold and his volunteers reached Maine, starting from Newbury, they came up to Kennebec, and he sent back his first message to Washington's headquarters here on September 25th, and he reported, "The Indians with Higgins are not yet arrived." And later, the Loyalist minister Jacob Bailey wrote with pleasure that the Norridgewocks and Pegwalkets had decided not to go on that expedition after all. So Colonel Arnold and his men were left more or less on their own to try to fight their way up the river and across to Quebec. Late in September 1775, the Reverend Samuel Kirkland, a Presbyterian missionary in his early 30s, arrived in Cambridge from in the Iroquois country. And with him came a man named Shenandoah of the Oneidas. The Utica Patriot later stated, "Shenandoah's person was tall, well-made, and robust. His countenance was intelligent, although he could speak but little English. He had embarrassed himself with a drunken celebration of a treaty in 1755, and after that Shenandoah took up Christianity, swore off alcohol, and became a very respected leader of the Oneidas. The Continental Congress had commissioned Kirkland to seek the friendship, or at least the neutrality, of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And Washington understood that Shenandoah was a Oneida chief of considerable rank in his own country, and he told the Massachusetts House, "He has come on a visit to the camp principally to satisfy his curiosity, but as his tribe has been very friendly to the United Colonies, and his report to his nation on his return have important consequences to the public interest, I have studiously endeavored to make his visit agreeable." After a few days, Kirkland and Shenandoah traveled on to the Congress at Philadelphia. In the spring of 1776, the consequences of that event became clear as the Iroquois Confederacy started to split. The Mohawks led 4 of the 6 nations in supporting the British. The Oneida and the Tuscarora, encouraged by Kirkland and Shenandoah, sided with the Americans, and this would prove to be one of the most significant political developments of the war. Meanwhile, in the fall of 1775, Colonel Lewis was one of several native warriors in the American Army invading Canada. He fought in General Montgomery's forces during the first part of its thrust toward Montreal and then toward Quebec. John Trumbull, who was at Cambridge headquarters during Colonel Lewis's first visit, sketched him in 1785 to include in the painting the death of General Montgomery. Here is this native figure based on Colonel Lewis. But Colonel Lewis wasn't actually there for that debacle when General Montgomery was killed. Instead, he was returning south. On January 21st, an American engineer wrote in his diary, 13 Indians came from Canada to see General Washington. On his first visit, Colonel Lewis was a solitary scout from Cognawaga. This time he brought 13 others. He was building an alliance. On July 24th, Washington told the Congress, 13 of the Cognawaga Indians arrived here on a visit. I shall take care to entertain them in such a manner during their stay here that they may return impressed with sentiments of friendship for us, and also of our great strength. Officers showed those men the fortifications in East Cambridge. John Adams passed through Cambridge on January 24th as he prepared to return to Philadelphia, and General Washington drew him into the effort to entertain the visiting Caughnawagas. Adams described dinner at the William Brattle House here. I dined with Colonel Mifflin at Colonel Mifflin's with the general and lady and a vast collection of other company, among whom were 6 or 7 sachems or warriors of the French Caughnawaga Indians, with several of their wives and children. I was introduced to them by the general as one of the Grand Council Fire at Philadelphia, which made them prick up their ears. They came and shook hands with me, and made me low bows and scrapes, etc. In short, I was much pleased with this day's entertainment. According to Adams, one of the Caughnawaga sachems whom he met was an Englishman, a native of this colony whose name was Williams, captivated in his infancy with his mother and adopted by some kind squaw. Adams must have misunderstood that story, because Eunice Williams was taken captive in the Deerfield raid of 1704. She is the unredeemed captive John Demos wrote about. When she was still a child, she became part of this Mohawk community. She had children herself. Her grandson, Thomas Williams, at this time was her only male descendant, and he might have therefore been one of the men at Cambridge that John Adams met. General Washington soon understood that the native men assembled in Cambridge wanted a kind of outdoors talk, a formal treaty negotiation and ceremony. So on January 30th, he met in native fashion with 13 of our Caughnawaga friends, plus 3 of the tribe of the St. John's and Passamaquoddy Indians from modern Maine and New Brunswick. Unfortunately, I haven't found a statement of where exactly in Cambridge this took place. Was it on the grounds of this house? Was it on the grounds of the William Brattle House, where Mifflin was hosting those dinners? Was it on the Cambridge Common? I just don't know. That event began with the Caughnawaga chief, Jean-Baptiste, stating, "We were sent by the first 5 tribes of Canada Indians to inquire into the cause of the quarrel between the people of England and our brothers in this country." And at Jean-Baptiste's request, Washington signed a copy of the Treaty of Albany that General Schuyler had negotiated. The native leader continued, "We are very glad that a firm peace is now made between us and our brothers. We now look upon ourselves to be free and like our brothers in New England." So he was demanding an equality there. The next recorded speaker was a man from the St. John's or Maliseet community up in Maine. He told Washington, "The English people are mad and very cross and want us to fight against the New England people. God is on the side of our brothers, and they will beat them. We want to go home quick to tell our friends what we have seen and done here, and next spring many of our nation will come and help the New England people. But first," this man said, "we are in much want of powder to hunt with. The old English people will not let us have any." In fact, the governor of Nova Scotia had sent the St. John's community ammunition and clothing in exchange for the same assurances of friendship that Washington was hearing. So this group was playing both sides off against each other. After the outdoors talk, Colonel Lewis and his fellow Caughnawagas returned to the north. By then, the tide of war in Canada had turned, however. The Americans were losing badly to both the British military and the weather and the smallpox. As I said before, most Mohawk groups then allied with the British. Thomas Williams became a chief among the Caughnawagas, but warring against the Americans from October 1776 on. Because it turned out that Colonel Lewis did not speak for his community, for the Caughnawaga community. He continued to work with the Americans, but he was one of the few who did. In June 1779, he finally received the commission, the real commission he wanted, as a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. Colonel Lewis thus became the highest ranking person of native or African descent in either army during the war. But for a while, because of the side he decided to ally himself with, he lost his home among Mohawks, and he had to find a new community among the Oneida. So once again, he was moving across national boundaries. As for the Stockbridge community, they remained in the Continental Army, fighting in Indian style in New York and New Jersey. On August 31st, 1778, they sustained a severe loss from a surprise attack of the Queen's Rangers near Kingsbridge, New York, losing over a dozen men at once. And given the small size of the Stockbridge community, this was a devastating economic blow. the town in western Massachusetts dwindled, and by 1790, almost all the native families moved to the Oneida country in New York. One of the last to remain in Massachusetts was remembered locally as Captain Yoke, Jehoiakim Yokin, veteran of the Siege of Boston. And that is the story of the Native Americans at the Siege of Boston. It does not have a happy ending because for most natives, the Revolutionary War did not have a happy ending. We can say that the Americans certainly won the war. The British came out, they lost the colonies, but they didn't come out too badly. But the natives of North America lost a great deal because what was holding back white settlement through the American colonies was the British Empire. And once that was gone, there was just this relentless push westward, as we know. So, as I say, this does not have a happy ending, but we nevertheless should recognize that there were many native men in the army around Boston. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions about what I've talked about here or other. Yes?
Are there any physical artifacts remaining of any of the prayer towns that you mentioned?
Are there physical art? Well, let's see. I mean, the towns of Natick, Mashpee, Aquina, Stockbridge, they all recognize this as part of their history.
The founding.
And yes, why they were founded, and in many places, such as Paganet, there are small communities, or especially Mashpee, small communities of people who trace their ancestry back to before English settlement. So yes, I would say that there are remnants. If you're asking, like, is there a structure or something like that, I don't know of them, in part because the what would have been built there were not these big grand houses that would be preserved, but smaller structures that would be less likely to survive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there were different strategies at work, that the first group saw themselves as American, Indians as Americans. The third group were like playing whoever was winning. And the second group, I'm not sure. Do you think that there were these different strategies at play?
I think they were starting from different places, where the first group were already, they were, even for the men from Natick, they were, they might had a local community of natives, and they had still family ties and some, but they were very much more surrounded by English culture and felt themselves to be members of those communities as well. Whereas the Stockbridge people still had hopes of having a separate native society within the larger British society. And indeed, the last group, the men from the north, they tended, although they had also had a great deal of contact and influence from Christian missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, they had much more independence, especially the Iroquois. And so they saw themselves as separate nations, or separate nations within the British Empire negotiating with the Bostonians. So yes, the strategies were very different. I think the outlooks were very different because of these different men's perception of their lives and the realities of their lives. Yes?
Were they treated the same as our soldiers were, I mean, in terms of being paid and being fed and...
The Revolutionary Army was, yes, they treated whites, blacks, natives the same in terms of pay, in terms of, there was no segregation within companies, things like that. And in fact, it was the last army to be integrated in the United States until after World War II. However, at the same time, we have to acknowledge that indeed, in this very site, George Washington was trying to kick out the soldiers of African descent in late 1775 until he changed his mind, or had it changed for him by the performance of those soldiers and the officers who spoke up for them. We also have to acknowledge how rare it was for a man of color to be given an officer's commission, like a couple of the men from Stockbridge, or like Col Lewis later in the war, when he seems to have been asking for it for years, and they finally granted it. So I would say that they were treated equally with other privates, with privates of European descent, but they did not have the same opportunities to rise to the officers' ranks, just as they didn't really have the same opportunities to rise within civil society into the ranks of gentlemen because of the overall racism. There was also a great deal more class structure at the time, so a poor working class white private would have also had difficulty becoming an officer and becoming a merchant or other professional after the war. Anything else? Yes.
Well, so kind of along the same lines, and you said that the lines are very blurred between the people of African descent and the native people. So did Washington have much to say about native people? He wanted he had opinions about people of African descent, but what about the native people?
He doesn't seem to have said much about the native soldiers he found in the army when he got here. And I think there are a couple of factors in that. One is that it wasn't his responsibility. They weren't landing on his desk. They had already been signed up. They were serving in these companies. There were a lot of layers between him and them. So he didn't have much reason to discuss their situation. Second thing is, I think that a lot of the people I've talked about would have been perceived by him as mulatto, and therefore in the category of African, rather than as native. And he, as a young man, he had had a great deal of experience with natives, but he had seen them out on the West with their own culture. So I think in his mind, the category of these Christianized native men wearing regular clothing with some African ancestry, he would have just classified them. He wouldn't have seen them as native. He had a lot to say about the emissaries like Col Lewis and Shenandoah. He did not have much to say at all about the Stockbridge and other Indians who were in the army when he arrived. He was a lot more concerned with the riflemen who came from Pennsylvania and Virginia, that country, who liked to fight in very much the same way, and would also go and sneak up and shoot at the British sentries and cause trouble in camp as well. And so I think he saw those people as sort of his people who had come with him, people who had been recruited from the Continental Army, by the Continental Congress, alongside him. And so he was more concerned with them and their behavior and their misbehavior, because I think he felt it more personally and then with the New Englanders. But it is a good question.
Did the Native Americans inspire the militia companies to fight in a particular way, in a non-traditional form?
It's a good question. Did the Native Americans inspire, did the Continentals decide to pick up their tactics?
Right.
I don't see that. They did try to emulate the riflemen when they came in by wearing some of the same clothing, something called a hunting shirt, which was thought to say, I am a backcountry marksman, and that would be scary to the British. But I think if you wanted to go all the way and look like a Stockbridge Indian, at least according to the description of them later, you had to do you had to shave your head and wear earrings and wear a totally different garment. And I don't think they were. I think that would have been a step too far for these New England farmers. And no, so I can't think of any example of New Englanders during the siege adopting the Indian tactics, in part because in the siege, where you were trying to drive the British out of this heavily fortified town surrounded by water, they weren't that effective to take out a few sentries here and there. It just they needed what they eventually got, which was big guns on Dorchester Heights, to make any sort of difference. Later in the war, there were definitely light infantry companies and irregulars and others that were fighting in quote-unquote the Indian style, sometimes including natives among them or as scouts, and sometimes just adopting those tactics. But around here, not so much.
You do have the scalping at Concord.
This is something which is an interesting situation. During the battle at the fight at the North Bridge in Concord on April 19, 1775, there were 3 British soldiers who were killed in the first in the fighting, and a young man from Concord walked by the site after the British had withdrawn and tomahawked one of those British soldiers, possibly before he was dead. Possibly, and this was then a little bit later, more British soldiers marched past this body as they were withdrawing from where the farm where they were searching. They saw this body with this bloody head wound, and they decided that this man had been scalped. It's quite unclear whether he actually was scalped, whether that was what the tomahawk blow was meant to do. They Concord sort of clustered around this young man and hid his identity for many years, and it was thought that he greatly regretted it. But as a result of that incident, the soldiers coming back from searching the farm told the rest of the soldiers in Concord that the Americans were scalping us, and then as they went back to Boston, they told other soldiers, and so this was held up by the British authorities as a great atrocity that the Americans had performed on the first day of the war, and indeed a sign that the Americans were fighting in the savage manner. There were far worse atrocities later, and real scalps being taken. This one, I'm not sure it would really count as scalping, but the British certainly saw it as scalping and feared it. And feared that the Americans would be that atrocious to prisoners. So it's one of these examples where the image, the imaginary native, is more powerful than real native. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming out on a winter day and a plaguey day, and I hope that you all had a good time and learned some things, and that we all go home and stay healthy. Thank you very much.